Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the What We've Learned series, and this is going to be episode 3, the update of the series after the previous 2 international breaks, which would have been, for example, the previous one being on episode 9, on Gameweek 9 as well. This is a good chance to update our understanding of teams, the team strengths, and where our expectations have moved since then, and also look at fixture difficulty ratings in light of the blank, and also the suspected double game week as well. But I will obviously talk about that later on in the video. In terms of expected goals and our understanding of team metrics, I think actually things haven't changed too much. If anything, I would actually say that Aston Villa and Brighton have probably swapped places within our minds and our expectations. Now you can actually see that Aston Villa have become quite a competent defensive team as well. But more specifically, they've become a competent attack, right? You can clearly see that they're more around that sort of average mark, I would say, in terms of defense. You can see a lot of teams are now teetering towards that sort of middle tier, whereas Arsenal have actually separated themselves a lot as a great defense, whereas City, for example, have also struggled. And part of that is simply because that Chelsea game was such a big outlier in terms of City's season overall from a defensive point of view, that now Arsenal look like what is very clearly the best defense in the league. So that's one thing to think about too. Now, if we contextualize Arsenal as the best defensive team in the league, and that might be the case, then actually I think obviously the value of their assets, even in tough fixtures, just like the way we would traditionally look at City, is very interesting, right? And I still think we can look at City in that sort of way. They're very clearly the best team in terms of the mix of both attack and defense, and then Newcastle falling slightly behind. So if you were to imagine there would be a curve running, from the bottom left corner of the chart towards the top right-hand corner, then obviously City is one of those teams that tracks incredibly well in terms of both attack and defense, as opposed to being, for example, a little bit of an outlier like Arsenal is, where there's such a good defense, not exactly such a great attack compared to some of the other teams in the Premier League. And you can see obviously Liverpool, for that reason, are almost the exact mirror of Arsenal. And we obviously know that Liverpool's defense in general has actually been very good this season. So I think I would expect Liverpool to be one of those teams also contending with City, come the end of the season, just in terms of their general performance. We know that they've been playing in a lot of 10 versus 11s, some 9 versus 11s, and that has skewed results ultimately. So Liverpool being actually, by far and away the best attack is very impressive. Now, keep in mind, of course, teams in the Premier League have not played each other at least once, right? We're only 12 game weeks in. There are a couple game weeks left before we can truly say you've played at least the entirety of the Premier League. So it is actually fair to say that some of the teams here have played tougher schedules. Some of the teams have played easier schedules. If anything, Liverpool have not faced City yet. So it's interesting to see what will happen, for example, in this upcoming fixture in the Etihad. However, anyways, Liverpool have shown to be an incredible offensive team, and no surprise as well. But I think another outlier too would be Chelsea, right? We've actually seen that Chelsea have been a top 3, top 4, top 5 team really in terms of underlying stats when we look at things on an aggregate basis. And it's really interesting to see that this Chelsea team have continued that, right? So the fact that, let's say, Caicedo, Gallagher, and even Enzo Fernandez is now kind of a universal constant within that team, and you have Nkunku coming back with Palmer obviously actually raising the level of Chelsea's attack, in my opinion, not just because he's been getting penalties, but simply because he's also been getting expected assists. If you actually look at, for example, some of the leaders in terms of expected assists, you will find Palmer there. And that's very interesting for his valuation as an asset. And I think a lot of people have been sort of overstating Nkunku, for example, talking about how Nkunku is going to take away Palmer's minutes, where I think that's actually a little bit of a reach. If anything, I think Jackson's minutes are probably most under threat for now. And we'll see, obviously, what happens within Game Week 13 or Game Week 14, what will happen to Chelsea, which is also why, for example, within my own team context, I think it makes sense to wait for the Palmer transfer until Game Week 16/17. As far as Aston Villa, as I said, very interesting to see that they've become a very promising attack. You can see obviously a top 5 attack right now. And that's an interesting sort of place for Aston Villa to be, because previously we thought, for example, a team like Brighton, definitely a top 5 attack, but much worse on defense. If anything, Brighton's actually a little bit worse in both things compared to Aston Villa, and even worse than, for example, Brentford. So nice to see, obviously, now that Brentford have come through some easy and tough fixtures, that they still are quite comfortably within that top right quadrant here, this better attack, better defense quadrant. And if anything, the team that has actually continuously grown within our expectations have been Everton. I've been talking about Everton for a while now. Unfortunately, of course, they had 10 points docked from them. I mean, unfortunately or not, there are rules, obviously, and we'll see what happens to City in the future, blah, blah, blah. But the reality, right, is that Everton, in terms of their actual performances on the field, have been incredible. And if anything, Tottenham have been overperforming. And it's no surprise, of course, that we've seen a little bit of a setback since Tottenham unfortunately succumbed to, a 9 versus 11 game, first of all. And then second of all, the ridiculous amount of XG that they gave to Chelsea within that fixture is also a little bit of an outlier in terms of where that sets Tottenham back as a defense. But you can also see that Tottenham in general, they're not one of the best attacks that we have in the league. If anything, they are comfortably, let's say, within that top half, but actually not really close to any of the teams like a Brighton, like a Brentford. And that shows that they'll probably continue to struggle with Maddison out, their key creative beacon. But for Son to do so well this season, I would say it is quite normal. We have seen Son overperform in the past. He is an overperformer. He is a clinical finisher. I would not be too scared about Son. What I would be concerned about is, do you want to continue owning assets like Vicario? Do you want to keep owning assets like Udogie? Probably not. The only exception and asterisk as to, for example, Pedro Porro, in my opinion, is because he's taking a lot more set pieces now that Maddison is out of the team. I think that's a huge benefit to Pedro Porro, and that probably makes him worthy of keeping in your team, considering that the fixture congestion, as I'll talk about later, isn't particularly good. Now, when we look at, let's say, some of the teams in the other quadrants, right? Because Tottenham truly, I would say, are the only team in the better attack, worse defense quadrant, which makes sense, right? We expect for Van de Ven and Romero to be out for a while, and that's going to have a huge impact on, let's say, how Tottenham posts results, because two of those fixtures will still be Aston Villa and City, where Romero's out, and we know Van de Ven is out until at least January or February. So that's going to have a huge impact in terms of, in my opinion, how we rate Spurs as a team. If anything, I would expect their defense to continue to post really poor results. As far as Crystal Palace, they've been, they are that team that always lives in that top left quadrant, which is worse attack, better defense. So I don't think there's anything we really need to update in terms of Crystal Palace, but I will also mention that they had Eze gone for a while, Elise gone for a while. These are players who actually contribute quite frequently towards the creative side of things. And obviously Eze is someone who actually does earn a lot of XG. So he is a little bit more of a player who's more geared towards actually finalizing chances, which is huge, right? Eze coming back, Elise coming back. You should expect, for example, the floor to be raised for this Crystal Palace attack. So we'll see where they land within a few weeks' time, given that their fixtures are also quite good. As far as the team like United, still shocking to actually see them quite, they are truly in that bottom quadrant, the bottom left one being worse attack, worse defense. If anything, we were talking about teams like Wolves actually sort of creeping out of that quadrant. And it makes sense that they're actually close to a team like United. I think ultimately, when you look at, let's say, the top 10 teams in the league, right, with maybe exception to, let's say, in terms of underlying stats at least, with exception to, let's say, Everton and maybe, let's say, Tottenham, who don't sit on that sort of top right quadrant, I think you can say that Wolves have been one of the teams that have generally overperformed against their expectations a lot, and in really tough games as well. The City game being a good example, the Spurs game arguably as well, just in terms of the game state. But then also, for example, United have been dismaying all season, so no surprise that they're actually here. Now, when you look at, of course, the league table, United are actually doing quite well, but we also know part of that context is simply they have been fortunate in games and in some outcomes, right? Just think about game week 1, where they were quite fortunate for Onana to not get sent off, for a penalty to not be drawn, and things like that. And they've had some pretty comfortable fixtures so far. They will have some tougher fixtures, and I do expect United to fall. So a team like Chelsea, for example, who are vastly overperforming not overperforming, I would say overperforming against, let's say, our initial expectations. The fact that they're actually posting such good underlying results means that I have more confidence in this Chelsea team in being able to actually continually move up the table. Whereas for United to actually continually move up, I think is a little bit of a stretch for me to actually believe that that can happen, given that the results so far have been so poor. So that's something to say about United. As far as West Ham, I think they've actually improved a little bit based on the last time we've seen. If anything, their attack has improved quite a bit, which is why, of course, you can see them teetering close to, for example, teams like Everton and United in this sort of attack line, which is going to be, for example, the x-axis here. So nice to see, of course, that West Ham's attack is quite good, but their defense have been woeful. And I think a lot of people have, for example, been questioning me about, why don't we have West Ham or more West Ham assets on the cheat sheet given their sort of great fixtures. And the reality, I think, is that their defense is incredibly dismaying. And if anything, if you already own Areola, I would definitely not be confident in the double up of this West Ham defense. And so that's something to say. The West Ham defense is very poor. And you can see, of course, teams like Bournemouth, Luton, and Sheffield United. I mean, we've been talking about them as really the worst teams in the league. And it's no surprise that they're sitting there at these sort of spots. But If anything, the true outlier, of course, is still Sheffield United. They are by far the worst attack and the worst defense in the league. So you can see them firmly in the bottom left. Burnley a little bit more in terms of being worse from the attacking point of view, just about as bad as Sheffield, if we're honest. And then Sheffield United, obviously. And then Burnley's defense has, on the contrary, been okay, right? Comparable to the levels of Fulham. And it will be interesting, of course. I know that Everton has lost 10 points, but in terms of the league table, I really think that these three teams, unfortunately, between Luton, Bournemouth, and Sheffield United, unfortunately, seem to be pretty much designed to be relegated. And that is the unfortunate thing. Bournemouth, however, have been posting good results recently, the most recent one being Newcastle 2-0. And that's going to be an interesting one where to see with Bournemouth, particularly with their good fixture schedule coming on for this sort of last quadrant of the first half of the season, to see what they'll do and see where they will move. Because obviously, in terms of how they've been playing, it's very clear that Iraola as a manager has been changing their playstyle, and it could be a matter of time before they sort of tick as a team. I do think that when we look at fixture difficulty rating later, that Bournemouth, we have expectations for them to move and separate themselves a little bit more away from, let's say, teams like Burnley, teams like Luton, and teams like Sheffield United, as I previously mentioned. So that's something to say in terms of our understanding of the teams. Now, in terms of fixture difficulty rating, I think the most important thing to say, of course, is that keep in mind the team strengths that we've seen, and keep in mind what we understand, right? Of course, we understand that some teams are very, very strong in terms of attack. Some teams are very strong in terms of defense. That's going to be, how it is. Fixture difficulty rating always takes into account the general quality of the fixtures. It doesn't necessarily say that City is a bad team and you should stop investing in City, or you should stop investing in Arsenal if you find City and Arsenal to be bottom of these fixture difficulty ratings. The reality, of course, is that you have good quality fixtures, you have bad quality fixtures, but of course, if you're a top team, you're not going to necessarily visualize these FPL picks and FPL assets as being bad at any sort of time. And that's what one thing I just wanted to contextualize in the beginning. Now, in terms of the defensive schedule difficulty rating, these have been presented by my friend FPL Chase, who you can find on social media. What I will say, of course, is that his fixture difficulty ratings have not, for example, shown the impact of the blank game week in Brentford and City in game week 18. So when you look at Brentford and when you look at City, don't be confused when you see Brentford high up on fixture difficulty rating. Yes, of course, they have a blank and we have to take into account of that. But what this is doing is really just looking at the quality of the fixtures, in and outside of the blank, and to suggest, of course, how tough they are outside of the blank. And that's why I think it's interesting when we talk about bringing in a Brentford keeper or bringing in Mbumo, that it actually makes a lot of sense, because you can see Brentford quite easily in the top half in terms of the actual quality of fixtures that they actually have to play. Liverpool, of course, being high is nice, but we know, of course, that's contextualized by, unfortunately, their really, really poor pricing. And with teams like Bournemouth and with West Ham, that's the issue, right? We've been talking about how they've been such poor defenses that it's hard to see, of course, why investing into the defense would make sense. We also own Areola, so really no need to dip into that. And the same thing with Wolves. Whereas with a team like Newcastle, it's interesting that Trippier is actually at such a high price, and we do expect good things from Trippier, but actually I think the fixture qualities are still quite poor for someone like Trippier right now, considering that, of course, you can maybe even stretch towards Trent. I think the reality is you need Newcastle's fixtures to be basically outstanding for Trippier to be worth it, given that he's now 7.0 in price. Now, it also depends on whether, let's say, players like Son, players like Saka remain fit, right? Because, of course, if those players are not fit, then, of course, you can sort of move towards a slightly more inefficient player like Trippier at times, and then just invest into Trippier as well. I think that's totally fine. As far as, let's say, Arsenal, you can see that their fixture difficulties are getting worse and worse as the weeks go by, so it makes sense to invest into an Arsenal asset now and then move out of that Arsenal asset later on in 3 game weeks time, because these fixture windows are actually just looking at, for example, set of 4 game weeks. And of course, as you can see, by the time we come to, let's say, game week 16, Arsenal have really, really poor fixtures. So it makes sense for us to probably invest into an Arsenal asset now and then move away from them. Whereas with City, it's the complete opposite, right? City have tough fixtures now, but actually, when you look into the future, City's fixtures are a lot better. And that's going to, of course, take into account how easy the fixtures are, with exception to the blank, right? So keep in mind, of course, City still do have a blank, and that's going to be a reality, right? As soon as we touch game week 15 to 18, that sort of window, but they actually play easier opponents, outside of the blank. So that's something to think about. As far as a team like, let's say, Man United, look, they have easier fixtures as well in the future. I think the tough thing that I sort of sit with United is that they're actually still relatively expensive assets. and only Maguire seems to be worth it. So we've been talking about how Maguire is a good pick. I still think that's the case. In terms of other outliers here, very clearly that Chelsea's fixture window is very similar to a team like City, where it's getting better and better. So it makes sense for us to actually wait a little bit, wait until around game week 15 or 16, and then actually then invest into a Chelsea defender. So someone like Colwill, if he finds his, or retains his space as the starting 11 player for Chelsea, then of course it makes sense to go into Colwill. But also at the same time, we know Reece James is going to be there and hopefully fit there and thereabouts. So it makes sense to think about Reece James, investing into him in the future. As far as other teams here, I think the issue with Liverpool really, even though they're top, is just how hard it is to actually get a nailed Liverpool player at a reasonable price, right? Outside of Trent, it doesn't seem like we actually have any player who's available. So it makes sense that you could try to gamble on Tsimikas going forwards. But with other players and other teams here, I think Newcastle is probably another team to look at where, once again, we can think about maybe reinvesting into a Newcastle asset as soon as, let's say, game week 15 onwards, and then think about, let's say, what is the situation of Botman, what is the situation of Lascelles, and then move into a Newcastle player then. Because for now, I think in the short term, I wouldn't say Newcastle have that standout fixtures where you have to definitely invest into them, because I do think Trippier has now, with the price rises, moved into a place where he's not suddenly underpriced as a pick. Now that's going to be the defensive schedule. As far as the offensive schedule now, just move on quickly to that. What I would say about the offensive schedule here is that, once again, it of course is going to be very roughly in line with the defensive schedule too. But keep in mind, of course, that our expectations of teams, particularly on the offensive and defensive point of view, is quite different. For example, you'll see a team like City here or United here are also still at the bottom, just like Arsenal as well. But previously, for example, we would have seen that City is a little bit higher in terms of the defensive schedule metric compared to, let's say, where they sit now in the offensive schedule metric. They're actually at the firm bottom in terms of offensive schedule. And part of that is because City's attack this season hasn't been, by far and away the best in the league. So it makes sense that our expectations for City's defense to be slightly worse, right? Now that we're seeing teams like Liverpool, teams like Newcastle, and even teams like Chelsea just do just as good as them, really, from an offensive point of view. As far as Brentford, though, them being first in terms of offensive schedule difficulty is beautiful. So that just means that maybe even if you book a transfer towards someone like Mbeumo, because he's so well priced as an asset, and honestly just still underpriced for our understanding of what he brings to the table, penalties, expected goals, non-penalty expected goals as well, and also a little bit of creativity as well from set pieces. So with Mbeumo, I do think he's going to be a great transfer for game week 14. I think you have to see this fixture in game week 13 as tough because it is Arsenal. It is at home, of course, so that's nice. But I would still say, of course, moving into Mbeumo in game week 14 is totally fine. You can just wait until that fixture. Now, we know that Mitoma, unfortunately, might not be available. And of course, Diaby, you might want to question his minutes as well. So if you're, let's say, in the camp of, let's say, wanting to move out of Diaby in the short term, then I think it makes sense to move away from Diaby and just simply think about going for Mbeumo now. But keep in mind, of course, a player like Eze, for example, here has good fixtures. As you can see, for example, where Crystal Palace are, it is firmly in the middle of the table there. But you also have to think how much of a key player is, let's say, someone like Eze, right? If you think that the general fixture run is good, which it is suggesting that Crystal Palace have a generally good fixture run. Keep in mind the context, of course, that Crystal Palace are one of the worst let's say attacks in the team. And so the fact that they're actually slightly above average in terms of expectations for goals here over this run suggests that I think Eze can be a very, very good short-term punt. Because the idea here, of course, is that even with a team as poor on attack as Crystal Palace, that their picks would still be relatively good for this run. So I do think that maybe investing into Eze in the short term also makes sense if you're looking for, let's say, an attacking midfield transfer for the time being. As far as West Ham, though, really nice to see, of course, that they're still postulating within that sort of top quadrant there. And so it makes sense, of course, for us to continue to invest into players like Kudus, who will benefit from, let's say, the Antonio injury, which actually seems to be medium to long term. And then, of course, you don't really exactly know what Bowen's injury is because he has withdrawn from the English national team. So I think it's going to be something that's worth looking into, right? Whether or not someone like Kudus will get perfect minutes and therefore Kudus becomes a very, very good transfer, or you simply just move towards someone like Bowen who could be playing center forward. Now, one thing I would also say is that we haven't had enough data for Bowen to really say, okay, he's going to be a better asset as a center forward. It's not the same case as Son. Every team is different in terms of how they play, how they utilize center forwards. And you'll see, for example, players like Ings, players like Antonio have not racked up good underlying stats, as center forwards for the West Ham team. So that's one thing I would just like to preface. However, the fixture difficulty here for a lot of teams, and particularly a lot of bottom half teams, is still very good. So Bournemouth, Everton, Wolves. The only thing I would say is within these pools of picks and teams, the only assets that I would really consider would be Solanke, first of all, from Bournemouth, a 90-minute player, someone who actually is absolutely nailed, and someone who also has penalties. As far as Wolves, I would still say it's Hwang, because unfortunately with Cunha, I think, honestly, his finishing is a bit shocking, and we might see that the landscape for the minutes for this Wolves team will change, right? Depending on, let's say, the performances from Sarabia, we might see more minutes from Sarabia, which would change, let's say, the structure of this Wolves team. And that obviously has, knock-on impacts on, let's say, whether you want to move into a Wolves pick. As far as Burnley, unfortunately with Foster out as well, hard to actually, believe that there's going to be a pick from this Burnley team that's really worth investing into. So therefore, I would also, pass on them. As far as with Everton, I think the only concern I have here, I think, is that Doucouré might be the best pick for this Everton team, but do you really want to invest into this Everton team is probably the first question to ask. And, are there other picks in the same price point as Doucouré that you might be a little bit more confident in? For example, just waiting for a little bit of time to actually go into Palmer makes sense for me. Then let's say punting the short term for Doucouré. And in terms of, let's say, Doucouré, just speaking back to him as well, does it make sense, for example, to just go for Hwang instead? I think that might be the case because, of course, Hwang is a bit more XG dominant. And also, another stat with Doucouré is that he has actually had a lot of high XG per shot sort of stats in terms of the league so far. So it means that Doucouré has actually been benefiting from a lot of great high quality chances in terms of XG, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he consistently gets into, decent XG chances. That might be, for example, suggesting that we need a little bit more data to sort of believe that the pattern will continue to exist, that Doucouré playing as a 10 and playing behind the striker will be that beneficial for his role, or whether it's a little bit like he's been overperforming so far and the underlying stats might actually average out to a little bit less in the future. Another thing too with Dominic Calvert-Lewin and Beto, unfortunately, I still think is the minutes thing and the concern as well. But Everton actually posting such good attacking results still suggests that they're still worth, dabbling into as a team. So I would say Doucouré and DCL are the ones to look at for that team. As far as Liverpool, we are moving slowly into a landscape where Salah is going to be leaping towards AFCON, and Darwin probably is going to be the one who actually receives the most minutes for this Liverpool team. So I think when we're talking about Liverpool's attack, it's just a case of probably, given that I would say 80% of the field owns Salah, what are your plans for Darwin? Do you have any plans for Darwin in the future? Because if anything, Liverpool's fixture difficulty, it still remains very, very good, even when you land towards game week 15 to 18. And then, of course, it tapers off around game week 16 to 19. But around then, you might just be wanting to go into Darwin. And the thing about Darwin, too, is, as a starting player, if he plays that many minutes, he's going to be very, very good value for money. So that's one thing I would say about Darwin. As far as other teams in terms of the bottom half here, it is, of course, not nice to see a team like Tottenham or even Aston Villa in that sort of bottom quadrant here, where, of course, you're probably expecting that it is time to move away from those assets. However, what I would say about Tottenham and Aston Villa is that, as you can see, their fixture difficulty is not that rough, right? I think as long as you can survive owning Son and survive owning Watkins for the short term, you could argue that actually the fixture difficulty improves later on, right, with players like Son and players like Watkins. So, for example, when we look at game week 18 and the blank game week there, those are your captaincy options, right, Watkins and Son. So it makes sense to actually, in my opinion, hold through the bad fixtures and then actually continue to own those assets, because I don't think there's any problem with them. Whereas with a team like Chelsea, with a team like City, then we can actually seriously consider around game week 16, around that time, whether we want to increasingly invest into those picks, right? Players like Palmer, players like Nkunku, just waiting, for example, between game weeks 14 to 15 to see what happens with Nkunku's minutes. See what happens with Man City, whether KDB is anywhere closer to coming back into the team, or whether Foden and Alvarez will continue to benefit from minutes. As far as United, I think we still have a lack of confidence in them. And then with Luton, of course, it might be the case that Carlton Morris might be an interesting pick if you're really trying to save some budget later down into the game weeks. But that's going to be in terms of the sort of overall assessment here for the fixture difficulty rating, how I feel about it, and how we should contextualize as well. Keep in mind, of course, that the blank game week is not really accurately reflected here. This is just showing that the strength of schedule, with exception to the blank game week. Keep in mind, of course, that you still need players to play. You will need a starting 11 on game week 18. And that might even, change your mind on whether you want to free hit or not. and whether it makes sense to, let's say, capitalize on Brentford having great fixtures and then also, be able to sort of live without the blank as well. So those are my thoughts right now in terms of what we've learned as soon as, in terms of this sort of stopping gap here with Game Week 12 just being finished, and then obviously us looking towards Game Week 13 in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and thank you once again to the members for financially supporting the channel. Otherwise, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next video.